evening, everyone, and welcome. I think the microphone's picking me up, even though you don't necessarily need me. Thank you all for coming. And I'm going to do just a short, brief introduction so that you all know who everybody is. My name is Rochelle Davis, and I'm an associate professor of anthropology here in the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies. We designed this event around thinking about children and childhood in Palestine. And so we have two speakers this evening. The first is, and they come from two different organizations. So the first speaker is Sulieman Mleahat, who is the ANERA Education Program Manager. And ANERA stands for the, I looked it up this time, American Near East Refugee Aid. And it's a development organization that was founded after the 1967 war and dedicated to improving the lives of Palestinian refugees and poor families in Gaza, the West Bank, and Lebanon. And their primary focus has been on helping local institutions become more self-sufficient. And so Sulieman is going to show a short video and then talk about the ANERA's new report on early childhood development in the West Bank and Gaza. And then he will talk using a PowerPoint about some of the sort of issues that come up. And then that'll be about 20 minutes, 15, he said? 15, 20 minutes. And then the second presentation is by Brad Parker, who is an attorney, and he's the International Advocacy Officer and Staff Attorney at Defense for Children International Palestine. And DCI Palestine, right, is an independent local Palestinian child rights organization based in Ramallah, dedicated to defending and promoting the rights of children living in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip. And so he is going to talk also for about 20 minutes on juvenile justice under Israeli military law. So when they're all done, we will then open up the floor for questions. So, thank you. And I'm going to hit the play button, is that right?
Yep.
And we're going to do the lights?
Yes.
Do we need to do the sound?
I thought we should start on a positive note. Thank you. Everyone's been saying I've been a bit somber this week, but we needn't be. When you're involved in early childhood development, it's quite an inspiring field to be involved in. You could just direct me how I can. Oh, that's there. Okay, lovely. Okay. My name is Sulieman Mleahat, and I was born in Palestine many years ago, not too many. And at a very young age, I won a scholarship and moved to the UK at the age of 10. And really, I've been involved in education all my life, as a student and as a graduate and an undergraduate, and for the past 20 years in the field of development. So, you know, it's such a pleasure, because, you know, when you study development, and you're a fabulous institution here, and we talk about international and what it actually means, international development means. It's been wonderful working with ANERA for 4 years, and to be able to literally translate education for all, translate child rights on the ground. You're making a difference to children's lives, and you're only too familiar with the fact that Palestine is probably Palestine-Israel most contentious issue in global politics, and Palestine and Israel, the West Bank, is the most contested piece of real estate in the world, and it's often very difficult to see the wood for the trees when you're in the field. But when you're working with young children, it really brings it home to you that irrespective of what happens at a macro level, you need to deliver things for children. Children are born with rights, and it's wonderful to be able to make a difference to many children's lives. Even though we're a small NGO relatively, we've made a significant difference. We've made huge inroads in terms of development in a very short period of time. And it's really a testament to ANERA and to actually the funders that you often hear about huge white elephant development projects, whether it's Africa, Middle East, and Southeast Asia, that actually you're able to, with a very small amount of money, you can make a real difference to children's lives. So, look, we frame our work in the context of child rights. We're trying to help children realize their rights, and my presentation is about childhood being denied. And I'm not kidding you that the situation for many Palestinian children, irrespective of the circumstances, they have their rights denied. And I'm involved with early childhood development, and many of you are probably familiar with ECD. Just briefly, education for all, or the realization of early childhood care and education, is the UN's first education for all goal, to be realized by 2015. It's critical. And when we talk about early childhood development, we refer to the period conception to 8. So we're not talking about just primary schools. Why? Because there's a groundswell of evidence to suggest that actually, from an economic perspective, for every dollar society spends during the preschool period, society gets anything from 8, depending on what you read, to $17 over the lifetime of that person's life. So critically, if you're wanting to invest in a prosperous Palestine, in a prosperous Israel, in a prosperous Middle East, you really need to be investing in early years. And often, and I'm engaging with colleagues in New York next week, and about why ECD is a precursor to peace, if you're investing in that. And often people talk about, when UNESCO and others and WHO talk about, why actually, if you invest in preschools, it's actually the first education for all goal, you're likely to meet the other 5 goals, because it's a precursor to achieving education quality, universal primary education, and so on and so forth. And if you teach a young child to read, or just develop their listening skills, then that person is likely to read and to be exposed and to have a wonderful life as a result of those formative years. So the economic argument is very, very strong. But we know, and I have a slide from a friend in London who put it together, it's just phenomenal, that actually the most sensitive period in the brain development of a child peaks at about 2.5 years of age. A colleague said the first 1,000 days of a child's life is the most important. Work it out, that's something like just over 3 years? No, just under 3 years. So you're peaking. The sensitive period is 2.5. And many societies are not investing. Most nations will not realize that first educational goal. And great, you look him up, Professor Heckman at the University of Chicago has done some wonderful work. Professor Shonkoff at Yale has done wonderful work about how the brain, after 5 years of age, starts to close down. Now, what's the reality for Palestinian children? Most live in poverty. In one survey last year, it showed that 85% of Gaza households are food insecure. The poverty rates fluctuate between 30 and 70%, so 67%. People are not accessing food, and it's not just Gaza, but a lot of communities in the West Bank that I visit. They don't have access to employment opportunities. They don't have access to basic resources. Agriculture is often not a good, worthwhile investment for a number of reasons. So people are desperately poor and food insecure. How does that manifest itself in a child's life? We know that anything in certain communities up to certainly, we know that school children, 58% from the Ministry of Education last year, 58% of school children are anemic. That figure is a lot higher for preschool children. Something like often 68% of certainly children in the first 2 years of their life are anemic. What's pretty horrific, and somebody asked me what stunting means. There are probably many health folks amongst you tonight. Stunting is the physical, is the irreversible damage to a child's physical makeup due to unfavorable circumstances such as poor health, poor nutrition, poor access to nutrition, poor parental awareness, etc. So some figures put stunting at, some research pieces put stunting at 10%, yet others put stunting at 34% in certain communities in northern Gaza. Now those figures are comparable to West Africa, and that's pretty, for a country like Palestine, Israel, Jordan, you shouldn't be experiencing that. These are middle-income economies, but this is the reality. And critically, our approach is holistic. You need to look at the whole needs of the child, the physical development, the social, the emotional, and cognitive. That's essentially one definition of ECD. So you're talking about conception to 8, and you're talking about the whole needs of the child, and you're talking about a framework in terms of programming and policy that looks at health interventions, nutritional support, psychosocial support, play, education, and so on and so forth. So we try and deliver that. So lack of stimulation and other ECD services are prevalent. Briefly, very few Palestinian children are accessing quality education opportunities, stimulation. Anything between 29 and 38%, that fluctuates, and we're talking about 1 year. And it's really, those figures are favorable, but you're not reaching anywhere near the EFA targets, the education for all targets. And crucially, we focus much of our work on the issues of quality in terms of service delivery, but we want to impact on access. The Palestinian Ministry of Education and others need to be looking at policies and programs to increase access to education opportunities for preschool children. So in terms of quality, most teachers are not trained to care for the needs of preschool children. There aren't the training opportunities. communities, and that's crucial because we've been into preschools. And don't quote me on this, but that preschool is one of the better ones we've visited. We knew that both teachers were physically abusing children, and that's the reality. And there are statistics around violence. Most preschools we visit, teachers are physically and verbally abusing children on a regular basis. So we needed, in terms of a training, the first things we address is issues of child rights. We do the introduction, we do active learning and what it means, learning theories, but immediately within the first week we talk about doing no harm to a child. Child rights and protection. Children are born with rights. You cannot physically, verbally and psychologically abuse them. We put the full stop immediately within the first week of their training, and everyone takes a step back. So centres are overcrowded, they have no resources. I joke about when we go in with our clipboard, my colleague and I, we visit the toilets, first thing we do, because it's essential for children, especially young children, to be able to access basic hygiene facilities within these institutions. So they lack the basic services. Pedagogy is really poor, and the community, interestingly, it's really interesting, and I haven't mentioned it much this week, but actually we've really, really struggled to engage mothers and fathers in terms of, and I don't know, it's possibly because of the overall sort of situation. People are somewhat despondent, and they see probably preschools as an opportunity to have a breather during the day, just pass on the children for that. But we've really struggled to engage with communities. Communities are really despondent. We've requested local contributions. Most don't contribute, and there's another debate altogether in terms of dependency on international aid, and the creature, the monster we've created, really. So that we have a responsibility as development practitioners to be able to practice with integrity, with care, and responsibly. And a lot of agencies don't do that, unfortunately, because they go in and they flood the market with that, and they come out, and that's not good. And we have to pick up the pieces. So, in terms of the community, very few parents have any idea about the health and the nutrition of their children, the abuse. We were at a session this morning in Brookings. There was one survey. The violence, violence is practiced in 90% of the home. Plus, So, and there are broader sectoral issues. There is no ECD strategy. There aren't the standards. There aren't the teaching professional pathways for teachers, and so on and so forth. Let me just talk briefly about how am I doing? 5 minutes at most. Right. We talk about sometimes this is really encouraging for those who actually make a donation to people, to agencies like Oxfam and the Red Cross and some, and to us. We are making a difference. For a few dollars, we can make a difference. Honestly, for $35 per child, we can make a difference in that school. Even when you're implementing a nutrition program, you can feed a preschool child in Gaza and support their growth monitoring and stimulation and screening and referral and education for $235 or $53. And we worked it out one of the proposals. For just over $200, you can cater for a child in Gaza for a year. I mean, we're talking about, when we talk about anemia, iron deficiency, it's about providing basic supplements like dates, which are available in Gaza. Iron rich, we can do that. We can overcome that. We can tell parents not to give children their tea with their breakfast in the morning. We can encourage them. So basically, of course, it just stops stops the absorption of various minerals and vitamins. We've supported 30% of Gaza preschools in the past year. So this is just one example. Making use of an old building. This is an old village preschool. It's being reborn as a preschool, and it will serve for another 50 years. We do fabulous training. We've trained something like 500 teachers. We have now a qualification, the first in Palestine in that sense, that's been accredited. It's going to be accredited by the ministry. It's recognized by the Ministry of Education. That's really good. This is this is where the children were being physically abused and were sitting in rows. But they're sitting there around the table, learning at their own pace and learning cooperatively. The stuff that you see here, London, wherever, this is happening in a small village just outside Ramallah. And this is many of you are familiar with reading is fundamental, and book start and so on and so forth. we've done this. A key issue for many education providers and development is how do you reach those who are not being reached, those who are not lucky enough to be enrolled in preschools. You've got to think of creative ways of reaching those parents and children. We're making reading materials available. We bought books from New York, from Scholastic, in Arabic books, fabulous books. And this is the first time, we bought The Caterpillar, Eric Carl's book, and it's just one of the most popular books in Gaza now. It's lovely, which is really, and we're making a difference, we really are. And we're working with parents, not male caregivers, female, sadly, because there's an issue about co-opting and bringing them on board. So we've done that. This is another village in the south of the West Bank. Children were huddled cold a year ago. We've provided curtains, carpets, toilets, books, materials, and here they are. The mothers are with their children making Play-Doh out of flour and paint. It's just basic things. This is when we see campaigns on the television talking about making a difference in children's lives. These are really examples of our work. So we're working very closely with the ministry to make sure that the systems are in place to be able to increase the access and improve the quality of ECD in Palestine. And this is what we're going to be doing over the next while. Thank you very much, and I look forward to chatting to you shortly.
Thank you so much.
15 or 20. Lovely. Thank you.
So I'll stand too, just so I can see everybody in the room, because I have to look at people. So I'm Brad. I work for Defense for Children International in Palestine. I'm a U.S. trained attorney, and I focus on international humanitarian law, international human rights law, child rights, and I work at DCI as a lawyer, working mainly on legal advocacy, UN mechanisms, taking the documentation that our field workers, our monitoring and documentation unit create and produce, and try to get that into the media, into policymakers' hands, anywhere I can to hopefully change the policies that affect Palestinian children living in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza, to increase child protection for those kids and end violence that they face as a result of the occupation. So I'll talk just briefly about what DCI Palestine is, what we do, and then I want to just focus on one aspect of the occupation that affects kids, and that's the Israeli military court system, the Israeli military law system, and kind of walk you through the process of how kids find themselves in that system and things that they face. So, as a child rights organization, we are the only Palestinian human rights organization that focuses specifically on children. There's a lot of Palestinian human rights organizations. They all focus on their particular issues, and we get pulled into that and collaborate with them a lot, but we are the only one that really focuses specifically on children's rights. We started in 1991 as a juvenile justice organization, so we provided legal aid to Palestinian kids charged in Israeli military courts. We did that for about 10, 12 years, and then decided that we needed to expand. We created a monitoring and documentation unit to document the violations that were happening around the Second Intifada. So we started the monitoring and documentation unit in about 2000. So it's been about 13, 14 years now where we are collecting affidavits, sworn affidavits from kids that have been arrested and ill-treated, shot with rubber bullets, shot with tear gas canisters, shot with live ammunition, affidavits from family members or kids that have been killed, whether it's in military offensives or live ammunition throughout the West Bank, Gaza, whatever it is. The work that we do is very violence heavy. Kids are subjected to violence regularly throughout the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza. It's often not associated with military offensives. You have Operation Cast Lead, you have Operation Pillar of Defense, you have attacks on Gaza, but the violence is there regularly in the refugee camps throughout the West Bank, in communities throughout the West Bank, communities where they're located near settlements, located near military camps, located near roads used by Israeli soldiers and settlers. That's where the violence happens, that's where kids are vulnerable, And those are really the communities that are targeted and affected, and where we spend most of our time documenting cases. So, talked a little bit about the documentation. We provide legal aid in the military courts. We represent about 30 to 40% of all the Palestinian kids charged in those courts. We also have a legal aid program in the Palestinian Authority courts. The problems sometimes are similar in both courts, with pretrial detention as the automatic process. You have interrogations without counsel, without family members present. But when we work in the PA side, the solutions are obviously a bit different, because that is a juvenile justice system that has issues with capacity, knowledge, training. So judges, prosecutors, police, they don't understand juvenile justice, they don't understand child rights, and they don't understand that children are entitled to special protections because they are children. In Israeli military courts, the solutions are different. Right? The military courts exist as part of the occupation. They are essentially a tool to implement the occupation through applying the military law to the Palestinian population. It's actually operating exactly as it's intended to, as a part of the occupation. So I'll walk through the Israeli military law briefly, because I'm an attorney and I have to talk about the law, but also because I think it's important to set the context for really just the systemic discrimination that exists from the start for the Palestinian population living in the West Bank and Gaza. So, military law. Does anybody, what's the difference between military law and civilian law? Does anybody in law students have that? Okay. In 1967,
Military law can be appealed. It cannot be appealed.
sort of. You're onto something. So military law is basically a military commander saying this is the law, right? The Palestinian population has no say in what those laws are, yet they regulate almost every aspect of their life. So if you're a Palestinian living in the West Bank, you don't have a government that's creating laws. Right? You have a military commander, an Israeli military commander, that issues military orders, and those regulate your life. So there's military orders that regulate property, there's military orders that provide the semblance of a criminal code. Right? So under Israeli military law, anyone 12 years and older is subject to being prosecuted in the military court, whether you're a man, woman, child. If you're a Palestinian, Israeli military law applies to you. You have Israeli settlers living in the same territory throughout the West Bank. Even though Israeli military law applies to the entire area, it's only applied to the Palestinian population. So Israeli settlers living in the same territory are subject to Israeli civilian law. So it's really the basic definition of discrimination, and that's the starting point. You have two separate legal frameworks for two separate people, and the only thing that determines which law applies is your identity, and that's it. Military law has severely fewer protections built into it, and I'll walk through some of them. So first, military order, there's about 1,700 of them. The one regarding criminal law or security offenses is 1651. And just to give you a sense of what the military law includes, it includes a lot of things that you recognize as regular old crimes that if you did something down the street here in Washington, D.C., you'd recognize that as probably a criminal offense that you'd be subject to penalties for. So you have assault as a crime or a security offense under the military law. You have damage to property. You have murder. But you also have more occupation-related offenses, more politically motivated offenses, like being a member of a banned organization, right? Pretty much every organization is banned in the West Bank, in Gaza, through the military law. So if you're a member of the PFLP, if you're a member of Hamas, if you're a member of any political party that you would identify as a political party, it's probably a banned organization under the military law. you have throwing stones as a specific charge under military law. Here, generally, if you go out and throw a stone, maybe you put it through somebody's car window. I hit my friend Daniel in the face. That's not going to be a stone throwing charge that I'll be charged with. It'll be something else. It'll be assault, it'll be battery, it'll be property damage. It won't be throwing stones as the charge. In the military law, you have throwing stones charge. Throwing stone at a military installation, throwing a stone at the separation barrier, the wall, huge concrete or the fence, that comes with a potential 10-year maximum sentence. You throw a stone at a moving object, so a military jeep, a person, a soldier, that comes with a potential penalty of 20 years. And I think those charges and those sentences, the potential sentences, give you a sense of the goals of the military law. They're not necessarily meant to punish people for conduct that they've done. It's really more of a system to control population, and you'll see some other aspects that I'll talk about that lean towards that. So, one key thing under the military law is you can be arrested without a warrant. So, if you think about what has to happen here in order to arrest somebody, we all kind of know there's some type of process that has to happen beforehand. A judge usually has to look at some evidence or something presented in front of them. That judge looks at it, has some type of independent oversight. He's not the police officer. The police officer can't issue the warrant. He has to take it to that judge. That judge says, okay, I think this meets the standard. He signs a warrant. And then the police can go out and execute that warrant, bring you into custody. In the West Bank, under military law, no warrants. What does that mean? It means soldiers can arrest anybody at any time that they suspect has violated one of the security offenses. They don't have to present evidence to anyone. They don't really have to do anything at all to justify that arrest. They can see Daniel walking down the street. He's a 15-year-old kid. They could recognize him from a demonstration maybe 2 weeks before, maybe 2 months before. It may not even be the person that they think. He could just somewhat resemble that person. If they think he threw a stone, that's enough to arrest him. Pull him in the Jeep, blindfold him, tie his hands behind his back, take him off to a military camp. He shows up in an interrogation room 24 hours later. That's it. There's no oversight over arrests. And this system is really, kids as young as 12 are brought into this through that process, through night raids, through different aspects. And it also affects younger kids. So you may be 11 years old, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're not going to be vulnerable. We see a lot of arrests or detentions of younger kids, so below 12 years old in Hebron. And you have a very contentious living situation. You have kids walking through checkpoints to go to school. You have a high number of soldiers present, a high number of settlers present. In that situation, you have kids as young as 5. It was one of the more sensational cases from the past year. But regularly, 9, 10, 11-year-old kids are detained for a few hours, questioned, asked about who throws stones in their neighborhood, who their neighbors are, have they thrown stones. Really is kind of an intelligence gathering operation where they subject these kids to sometimes physical violence, different things, all in this setting that's highly militarized, highly contentious, and kids are vulnerable. So what's the typical case? So kids, about half of all the kids arrested in the West Bank are arrested from their homes in the middle of the night, so during night raids. And between 12 a.m. to 5 a.m., heavily armed soldiers come into the village, bang on your door. Kids usually report that that's the first sound they hear. They hear banging on their door, they're startled, awake. The father goes to open the door, maybe an older brother goes to open the door. Maybe the soldiers just bang it down. The soldiers come in, they ask for IDs. If you're on their list, or if you're not on their list, they check IDs, and They bring you out into the front of the house usually, blindfold, hands tied behind your back with a single plastic cord, and then you're ushered off into a military jeep. Your family's not told where you're being taken, not told why you're being taken, what you're being charged with, if you're being charged. Essentially, you disappear from your family's perspective at that time. 75% of kids face or encounter some form of physical violence during the arrest, transfer, interrogation after an arrest. And that physical violence happens usually in the 24-hour to 48-hour period following an arrest. So you're arrested during a night raid, it's 2 a.m., you might be elbowed, kicked, punched as you're being brought to the military jeep. You'll be shoved in maybe, you bang your knee. You're probably not going to get any medical treatment for that for a while. You're blindfolded in the back of the jeep. Most kids are placed on the floor, on the middle floor, and then there's benches in the back of the jeeps where the soldiers sit. So you think of yourself being arrested by the police, by anyone with authority, and then you're surrounded by them. You're blindfolded, your hands are tied. It's an extremely vulnerable situation, and then you're a 15-year-old, 14-year-old kid. And when you're in that jeep, you're hit. Kids are hit with rifles, kids are hit with helmets, kids are hit with beer bottles. You're transferred around usually. So say you're arrested at 2 a.m., you'll probably arrive at a military camp nearby your village, say 3 a.m., and then you're taken out, you're put on the ground, and you just sit there until the sun comes up and the interrogators start working at the police station in the settlement nearby. Say 9 a.m., you're put back in the jeep, you haven't had food, water, you haven't even had your blindfold off probably, your hands are still tied. Usually if you ask to have them loosened because they're painful, they get tightened even more. So you haven't slept, you've probably been outside, it's either cold or it's either hot. You're put in the jeep, you don't know where you're being transferred next, and then you appear in a room, an interrogation room, with usually an Israeli police officer, interrogator. For some of the older kids, they get transferred to the Israeli Security Agency interrogation rooms inside Israel. They get held in solitary confinement. We have about 20% of cases that we document involve solitary confinement, specifically for interrogation purposes. So this isn't, we don't have a space for a child and we want to keep them from an adult population. This is, we want to interrogate this child. We're going to use solitary confinement to get as much out of him as we can, and to break him down. And we're going to tell him, and we're going to put him in solitary and let him rot until he talks. So this is a situation that kids find themselves in. A typical interrogation, kids don't have access to counsel. In 95% of the cases we document, kids don't have access to counsel prior to an interrogation. They don't have an attorney present during interrogation. They don't have a family member present during interrogation. They're alone. They don't really have much of a chance, whether they've done something or not. And I should say that, as a child rights organization, our primary consideration is really the best interests of the child. So it's not about guilt or innocence for us, right? We're a legal aid organization, we're a human rights organization. There's basic minimum standards that people require under international law, and children have special protections under international law. Denying them access to counsel, denying them a parent during interrogation, detaining them in the first place really violate everything that you would expect those protections to have. So interrogations are really built around obtaining confession, right? You don't have access to counsel. Confession, whatever evidence, whatever statements come out of that would be excluded here in the U.S. In the military courts, that's standard practice, right? And even confessions that are drafted in Hebrew, that happens in about 20% of cases. they're not excluded in the military courts as evidence. The kids don't speak Hebrew. They have no idea what that confession says. An interrogator types it on a computer, prints it out, forces them to sign it, and then that's evidence in their file. Confessions are really the primary piece of evidence in the military courts. There's not much else. There's no police investigation process. In some cases where there is something that's a pretty serious offense, there will be an investigation and they will try to find documentation. But generally, you have a confession that's your own. You have statements from other children or adults that have probably been coerced or possibly even obtained through torture. They'll be in your file. Sometimes in interrogation, quite often actually, kids are confronted with statements of other kids. So an interrogator sits them down. They just interrogated his friend who was also arrested that night. The friend maybe gave his name, and then the interrogator confronts him with that testimony or whatever that statement is. And the kid feels like, I have no other option. I don't know what to do. Since they haven't had access to counsel, the parent present, they confess. If you're a kid living near a settlement in some of these villages that are really targeted for arrests, say it's a village that has weekly protests, they also have lots of arrests of their kids in those villages. If your friend was arrested 3 months before, you're a little bit worried the next time the Israeli army comes into town because you know you might be arrested. You know that your friend might have given your name during an interrogation, and that's enough to justify an arrest, and that's what happens. Once you're in the military court, for a DCI lawyer that represents one of these kids, you're really limited in what you can do. Kids usually have that confession in their file. They're not excluded. Kids in their file also have statements from other kids. Those are not excluded. You have the third piece of evidence that's regularly in files are statements from other soldiers, or statements from the arresting soldier, basically saying, I saw this child doing this at this date, and it's a military court system. The judges are military officers, either active duty or reserve duty. You think of a military judge discounting the testimony of a soldier. It sort of goes against the whole military code, and it just doesn't happen. So kids plead guilty because it's the fastest way to get them out of that system. There's automatic pretrial detention. Your first court hearing, you show up, the judge extends your detention to the end of legal proceedings. Bail's rarely granted. So even in a case where a child's charged with one stone throwing offense, maybe he's 12 years old, that case, maybe you get bail, but not always. The older you are, the less likely. But the more likely it is that you'll spend a significant amount of time in detention. Kids plead guilty, maybe one stone throwing charge. You'd expect a 3-month plea, but the timing usually works out that by the time the military prosecutor accepts that plea, you've already spent 3 months in detention. You get time served, maybe a suspended sentence of 3 years where if you get charged with the same offense again, you automatically serve a certain amount of time within that 3-year period. Yeah. So let's talk about context. Data is really difficult to obtain about the scope of arrests and detentions. The Israeli Prison Service, which monitors, is responsible for the prisoner population, only releases a snapshot of the total number of kids in detention on a particular day. So for January, on January 30th, we know that 183 Palestinian kids were held in Israeli military detention. 20 of those kids were between 12 and 15 years old. That doesn't tell us who was in detention on the day before or the day after. So based on those kind of monthly snapshots, we say and estimate that about 500 to 700 kids are arrested each year. Recently, the military prosecutor in the West Bank placed a number, he was trying to refute the fact that our numbers weren't accurate by saying that 1,000 kids were arrested in 2013, which is more than what we say, so I don't understand what he was doing, but you know, there's a problem with the numbers, obviously, but we know that it's somewhere between 500 and 700 each year, and about 8,000 kids since 2000. The typical sentence, the average sentence, kids spend about 3 to 4.5 months in prison, whether it's pretrial detention or serving a sentence. And that, you know, if you're a 17-year-old kid that has 2 stone throwing charges, maybe you're a member of a band organization as well, that could be an 18-month sentence. So you really have a wide fluctuation between the number, or the sentence and the pretrial detention, depending on your age. So what do we do about it? So in a system that's not really set up to administer justice, it's really a mechanism of control. Right? It targets specific communities throughout the West Bank. Basically, based on their proximity to settlements, to military presence, wherever soldiers and settlers are, those are communities that are going to be affected by arrests and violence. We provide legal aid. We are successful in limiting the amount of time kids serve, whether pretrial or in sentencing, because we have particular child rights focused training, and the attorneys that we use only represent kids. They're DCI Palestine staff. They work specifically with kids. They're juvenile justice experts. Some of the other attorneys that work in the Israeli military courts don't necessarily have that expertise. So if you're used to representing adult prisoners, and you get a case of a 15-year-old kid with 1 stone throwing charge, and the military prosecutor says, okay, I'll take a plea agreement for 9 months. If that's an adult, they're probably going to get 24 or 36 months. So that sounds pretty good to you. But we know that we can make arguments, we can rely on international law to a slight degree, rely on the fact that he's a child, and make specific arguments to the military court judge that will probably reduce that to about a 3-month period. And that's something that, in a system that really doesn't work, it's not set up to work, it's set up to do exactly what it's doing, that's a success. We also have a Know Your Rights campaign that we started on a couple different occasions that we train. We have field workers and our attorneys go into schools who work with the Ministry of Education and provide trainings on what rights should exist under the military court system, and then what the process typically is if you are arrested. Because one of the things that we notice is that kids are arrested and they have no idea what comes next. Some kids are afraid that they're going to be killed. I mean, they feel like they've been kidnapped. It's not a typical arrest, right? The process is a bit different. So kids are scared, and younger kids particularly have no idea what comes next. I should probably stop because I'm talking a bunch, and I want to hear from you and answer questions. So.
Thank you. Any questions for anyone? Yeah, please go.
I'm sorry I came in late, but so this may be already been answered, but do you have regular communications with civil rights lawyers in this country so that you can amplify the affidavit kind of information that you're receiving? And I wanted to know, are you like a USAID NGO, or is there State Department support for what you do? And also, I certainly think that the 2 films that came out that were submitted to the Oscars, certainly Omar speaks to what you're talking of, and even Bethlehem does in its own way. And so I think that voice was actually very powerful. It really resonates. I'm an unemployed Arabist myself, but I graduated from CCAS in the early 80s, and I'm still deeply concerned about the social justice aspect of this conflict, and so that's why I'm asking the question. My name is Mary Nesnick, and I'm an abject failure, but I think what you're doing is very important.
Should I just answer?
Yeah.
Just do one? Okay. So we're a local Palestinian human rights organization. I'm the only international employee. Everybody else is really local Palestinian. They work in the communities that they serve. We don't take U.S. aid money. We don't take State Department money. We work closely with the State Department and the folks in the East Jerusalem consulate, and they include our documentation and information in their human rights report and other areas. And we do, I mean, part of what we do as an organization is try to get as many people committed to the issues that we work on, engaged in those issues, and then hopefully turn them into action. So we work with lawyers from both the US, the UK, Europe. Delegations come, we take them to the military courts, we have them meet a family, we have them speak with a child who's been arrested or suffered some other form of violence, in an effort to really raise awareness and then also take action and hopefully increase pressure to change the policies that impact these kids. Because it's not, you know, it's and I like the way that you put it before, it's, you know, it's one of the most contested pieces of real estate. It's this conflict that just continues indefinitely. There's a lot of talk about negotiations and a lot of talk about peace, but the day-to-day effects, I mean, it impacts everyone. And the kids are the most vulnerable. And I think it's important for me, for this work, and I think it's more rewarding personally to work in children's rights, particularly in Palestine, because you see changes. They're tiny, but you see that they do make a difference in a particular kid's life, and who knows what that means. But compared to some of the other work and some of the other colleagues that we have, I think it's a bit more rewarding, and you do achieve things where you might not be able to say that. And I think, you know, we could talk for hours and hours and hours about the particular issues that come up, because it's such a complex setting, complex issues, and everything overlaps. Nothing is just off on its own. So Omar, from movies you mentioned, the informants, that's a whole other issue that you could talk about for another hour. Kids in solitary, I mean, the pressure to become informants, huge. Getting a child to talk about it, not so easy, because of the implications it has within their communities, within society. I mean, really complex issues that a 15-year-old kid, a 14-year-old kid is trying to grapple with alone, in solitary confinement, in a cell, without food, without water, and he's been physically abused. I mean, and you see these kids after this, and they have issues. There's a lot of psychosocial problems. PTSD is a huge problem throughout the area for all Palestinian children. But they're resilient. And I think that's what keeps everybody, at least at DCI Palestine, kind of moving forward and stem off despair.
Yes.
I have two questions for Sulieman. My name is Daniel. I'm a PhD student at George Washington. You mentioned very briefly the negative impact that international aid reliance has had on ANERA's work and maybe on early child development. I was wondering if you could elaborate on that a little bit. And my second question is, you mentioned that you work with the ministry. I'm guessing you're talking about the Ministry of Education within the PA. How has your work been affected by the fact that PA ministry functions differently in Gaza, that they have less influence in East Jerusalem and in Area C? I was wondering if you could speak about the disparities there in terms of regions.
That's two very good questions. Okay. I was the topic of this evening is not related on aid effectiveness, of course, and I speak anecdotally. Mm-hmm. And I've seen a change.
Can you speak louder? They can't hear you.
Okay, sorry. I spoke about how challenging it is to work in communities in relation to the care, education, and development of children, preschool children. And I mentioned that actually often there's been a growth in dependency culture in the West Bank and Gaza, and I'm only using it in an anecdotal way. It would be good to study this further and to see to what extent have those has society evolved since the signing of the Oslo Accords. Historically, the Palestinians were fairly dependent. There was a great deal of community cohesion, etc. And I would advocate for research in this area. Anecdotally, communities are reluctant to engage, and that's really not. It hasn't been positive. It's been really quite negative. And I often say it's from Ramallah to Ramadin, but actually it's from Ramallah, north of the West Bank, down to Rafah. We've encountered huge problems. They're expecting you to do this. The parents are expecting you to look after the children and stuff. And that's probably part and parcel of the political, the overall political, social, and economic malaise or the quagmire that is the West Bank and Gaza. But I'm not able to actually qualify a lot of that. I studied many years ago, but I'm not able to qualify the issue of dependency on aid. But certainly, when you look at issues of dependency on food aid, we're talking about 85% of people who are in Gaza who are food insecure and are reliant on extended, and that's not good. That's not good for societal development, of course. That's it. In terms of the ministry, I said this morning at Griffin's. Often governments and authorities, national authorities, get unfairly blamed. And when we talk about duty bearers and children are born with inherent rights, etc. We're talking about a very complex context in the Palestinian Authority where budgets are limited, human resource capacity isn't there at the ministry. To give you an example, when I said this, we have the Palestinian Authority has there are just over 1,000 KGs, 1,200, 1,300, and varies what's been registered and what hasn't. But let's just say 1,300 preschools in the West Bank alone, and there are about 500 in Gaza. There are 16 governmental MOE supervisors. There are only 16. And when in speaking to those individuals, most have something like 70 to 80 preschools to look after and supervise. And I often joke with them, say, what do you do with your spare time, And that's a reality. And when we're talking about child rights, we're not talking, there's a spectrum of child rights. You're talking about military detention here, abuse of legal rights and so on and so forth. But we're talking about the right to health, the right to food, the right to play. Those are being denied for a variety of internal factors and external factors in Gaza and the West Bank. I read somewhere only this morning that a Gaza Community Mental Health Program 2012, 50% of Gazan children will develop PSTDs. 350,000 children will develop trauma, will be traumatized. And I think that figure is actually modest in that sense. So back to the Ministry of Education. There are a lot of well-intentioned individuals who are actually demoralized, who don't have much capacity, who do not have much jurisdiction. They're able to engage in ANERA, but in a limited way. But in the context of ECD, there's very little provision in those areas anyway. So that actually often ECD provision occurs in urban centres. So many of the communities in and around Area C do not have access. So it's actually, it's fairly academic in that context. But I always advocate for working with duty bearers, working with ministries, because actually mostly they're just as vulnerable as the NGOs and the civil society organizations, if not more so, because they get blamed for everything, which is unfair, I think. You put that on record and send it to the Ministry of Education. That would be good. Yeah.
Other questions? Yeah.
My name's Tom New. I'm a GU graduate from some time back. And I have a question for Brad. I'm sure that age matters when it comes to dealing with the military justice system. And 12 doesn't sound like the international standard for treating a human being as an adult. What kind of influences or pressures are being brought to bear? And is there any chance that the Israeli government will raise that age limit?
So there's two different age limits, right? So 12 is the age of criminal responsibility is usually below 18, and there's some different standards for what that should be. 12 is in line with that for the most part. And 12 is the same as under Israeli civilian jurisdiction. So you have equality at least at the floor. On the upper side, right, what's a child? So the international standard is anyone under 18 years old. That is what it is now under Israeli military law, but it used to be 16. So that was changed in 2011. So it's a fairly new change, and it was brought about, I mean, it was so out of line with everything that's happening throughout the world, throughout international juvenile justice standards, that it took really an overwhelming amount of pressure, more than you would ever expect, to just get that one change. And that has really lasted up until now as a justification for the Israeli military courts and the military law system as saying we're trying to make changes. But what we see is, so the age may be 18, but 16 and 17-year-olds are still, can still be sentenced as adults. The pretrial detention time, where from the moment of arrest before a child has to be brought before a military court judge for the first time, for 16 and 17-year-olds, that's the same as adults. It's 4 days, right? So you have the age of majority being raised, but it didn't affect any other provisions in the military law. It didn't affect sentencing provisions, and it didn't affect several other pieces. So in the end, in practice, it didn't really change anything. Now, because that, all the pressure that both through UN mechanisms, through the State Department to a certain extent, and other folks, there's, for the first time, really a lot of pressure to change operational pieces, practical pieces. So there's talk of implementing a summons process. So for a number of years, probably about 8-9 years now, we've been saying, if you end night arrest, come up with a summons process, some other form to question kids, that provide access to counsel, provide a parent during interrogations, you'll be able to eliminate the ill treatment, because it really happens immediately after an arrest. Families don't know where the kids will be taken. They disappear, essentially, right? And they're ill-treated in the jeeps, they're ill-treated in the military camps. So there's been talk, it's been announced that they're going to have a pilot program for a summons process. We're not sure if it's a written summons, we're not sure if it's a summons by mobile phone, not sure what that summons will say, if it'll have a charge, if it'll have a 24-hour period where a child can have the opportunity to consult an attorney. But that's progress. That's the first operational change. We have a few cases from February, about 10 cases from around Nablus, a small village outside Nablus, where kids were actually summoned via their mobile phones. In one case, the Army did a night raid on the village, banged on the door, the same as if they would go to arrest a kid, and then provided a paper summons, and then they left. So you still get that control aspect, right? Scaring the family, making the younger kids a little bit terrified of what's happening. So I think there's potential to shift the military court system one way or the other. And I think the Israeli authorities are balancing that right now and having a few kind of difficult discussions, because right, you have a justice system. If you're interested in administering justice, you don't arrest kids from their homes in the middle of the night and ill-treat 75% of them. You have some formal process that makes them show up for questioning, allows them to have access to counsel, is interested in gathering evidence to hold people accountable for something, generally. If you're interested in really using the tool to legitimize the control aspect of the occupation, then you do night raids on villages that are problematic for a variety of reasons to your occupation. So I think that's what's happening now. Before you had they could change the age of majority to 18, and that was an improvement. it didn't change anything in practice, but they could claim that it was something that they were moving forward and were trying to do something. So the pressure works slowly.
My name is Carly Armstrong with the Public International and Policy Group, and my question is also for Brad, also regarding the international component to the work that you're doing. And I'm just curious, what is the response that you receive, like when you bring up issues like potentially Israel violating like the rights of the child, or when you raise those issues in court currently? Does it give you any traction whatsoever, or for the most part, not really?
The military judges are a bit interesting. I think they find themselves in it's a difficult position for themselves. I think there's a film that was an Israeli public TV documentary it's called The Law in These Parts. And if you've seen it, it's excellent. It's a bit long. If you're an attorney, you'll love it. If you're not, you might turn it off. But it gives you a good sense of how the military court judges either grapple with the issues that are in front of them or completely ignore those issues. And I think you have a couple of military court judges that are trying to, they're maybe not their best, but they're trying to challenge some of the things that are just systematic and very difficult to go against within the military court system. But for the most part, people are more aware now about international mechanisms. Talk of the ICC makes people a little bit worried. Following Kasled, the Israeli army created a unit that is a legal department that advises soldiers when they travel abroad about the possible legal implications of that. So there's awareness about possible accountability, and the military court judges are very much aware of the international law, the international treaties, that they are relying on evidence that probably has been coerced, probably obtained through torture, and you see that playing out in the courts. You don't know where it goes, but it is interesting, and you can see it there. Does it make a difference for the kids? Not usually. Usually they still rely on the evidence. They'll say that they're highly concerned that this child probably faced some form of physical violence during the arrest. They may not attribute it to the interrogation, and then they'll still rely on the evidence. But they're attempting to distance themselves from that conduct through their decisions. Hopefully they will continue to do that more, and then exclude evidence, which is what should happen. But
Hi, my name is Ani Petrosian, and I'm an intern at Physicians for Human Rights. I didn't go to Georgetown, I was Michigan Purdue with background in anthropology.
it's okay.
Anyway, I went to Sulieman's lecture earlier today at Brookings, and it was fascinating, so thank you for speaking to me. I was particularly interested in the discussion about parenting and the role of the father. My question is for Brad, and I was wondering, are there ever cases where permanent disappearances or fatalities after the arrest? I'm not sure if you touched on that.
No, I mean, not off the top of my head. I don't remember a particular case ever of a child. There's some adult prisoners that are obviously tortured and die in custody. I can't think of a case that I remember where that's happened to a child. I mean, kids get shot, they get killed, they get bombs dropped on them, they have drone strikes target them directly when they're walking down the street in Gaza. But generally in interrogations, it's shifted from relying on physical violence to more psychological methods. So, think of yourself in an interrogation with even a Metro police officer. There's a huge power disparity. You're going to be, as an adult, knowing a little bit about some legal protections, you're still going to be at an extreme disadvantage. So it really, they interrogate people all the time as part of the occupation, that's part of the process. So they know what they're doing, they know how to pressure people, and they get it. Yeah, and since 2007, 605 children in Gaza have been killed, about 2,200 injured as a direct result of conflict. Yeah, and that's, yeah, yeah. And we have, I laugh and I smile when I talk sometimes, because it's just so ridiculous to me that these are the numbers. and that this happens on a very systematic, widespread basis, and that it's just operational. I mean, that's just what happens.
We were asked, I was asked a question at Brookings earlier, in Sulieman, the situation is a bit better than other areas across the Middle East. You're talking about 30% enrollment, etc. And I often say Palestine or occupied Palestinian territories are unique because many of these issues are avoidable. They shouldn't happen, really. Whether it's legal child imprisonment, child torture, or child stunting, or child malnutrition or anemia, etc. These things can be addressed in a very short period of time if efforts can be concerted and focused.
Yeah.
And that's what's making a difference. The infrastructure is there to address and to help children learn, play, and be healthy and be nutritious, and so on and so on, in that sense. And that's what makes it unique, I think.
Yeah.
The fact that many of these things are avoidable.
And I talk about military law and talk about the problems with it, and in the sense that it's all avoidable, the solution is fairly easy. It takes a military commander in the West Bank to just draft a new order, and kids can have access to counsel. And so when you think about that, and you think about how much opposition there is to it and how many obstacles people say there is, I mean, it's not true. It's easy if you want to. It takes a few people to change their mind that they want to change the way the system fundamentally works. As a human rights organization, Palestinian organization, a legal aid organization, we don't think kids should be prosecuted in military courts at all. Right? They lack basic fundamental guarantees. But if they are, we want these protections built in. And that's what a military commander can do. He can just decide that that's the case and do that.
Absolutely. Access to clean water. It really is fairly simple. You can have a pipe from the West Bank to Gaza if you can do it. It won't be terribly costly. 90% of the aquifer in Gaza is undrinkable. It's not fit for human consumption. Nitrate and chloride levels are 10 times higher than WHO minimum standard. You can address issues of the right to water and the right to health, really, in a very systematic way and an easy way. Often you see, we read figures in terms of poverty rates. It's quite dizzying because you often read things about rates at 33.2%, youth unemployment at 50%. And then a few months later, it either drops or fluctuates. And of course, clearly there's something at play there. And if you're able to actually ensure Palestinians accessibility to the Israeli labour market, you can almost overnight ensure that children have access to food. And the whole that Gaza has been hermetically sealed for the best part of 7 years, or 6 or 7 years. Freedom of movement ensures that children can access healthcare in the West Bank. They can't. Often people, children and adults are granted permission to cross into Israel and up to Maqasid and Augusta, Victoria. But by the time, it's often too late. Or their permits, they can't travel because their permits have ceased or just run out, etc.
Or they'll give a permit to the child, but not to the accompanying person. And you have to go back and have another person accompany them. They'll get a permit, but by that time, maybe they lose their eye. They have some other. That's what happens.
Yeah.
Mothers are. Could go on.
My question is for Sulieman. Thank you both for coming. This is really important discussion. I guess what I want to know about, you talk about malnutrition for children, and I'm sure there's going to be a different answer to my question for the West Bank versus Gaza, but I wonder if you could talk about comparing and contrasting maybe these challenges in terms of resources not being available versus the challenges in terms of spreading awareness and educating, parents and families about different sort of nutrition ways to kind of prevent malnutrition. So which one of those, or are they both equally present? And because it seems like, you know, the Israeli occupation is a systemic problem, and I think we all kind of agree that that's not going anywhere, but then if you can focus on this education and awareness raising, you know, that seems like a more positive, hopeful kind of takeaway.
Great question. I think it's obvious. If you're going to live in Ramallah, most children are going to have better nutrition status and access to food than if you live in Rafah or Ramadi in the southern the West Bank. But interestingly, the Lancet and other journals have looked at health, nutrition status of children in certain communities in the West Bank, and often, in certain incidents, certainly in some of the research I've read, that stunting is prevalent in I think the rates are 29% amongst children in certain communities in the West Bank. So in terms of geography, I don't think it's matter. Gaza is often cited as a particularly bad case, but certain communities in the Jordan Valley, the north of the West Bank, and certainly the southern tip of the West Bank, you know, you go into preschools, and certainly Qalandia, which is next door to the difference between those two preschools is phenomenal. You go to Beit Hijza, and it is really, in terms of, I often think it's just ignorance. They have access, the villagers do have access to employment opportunity. The children look visibly better than when you go to Qalandia. Laura, you were there 2 weeks ago. And the children look terribly weedy and disheveled in a refugee camp. So in terms of geography, I don't think it really matters between the West Bank and Gaza. And in terms of do you provide food? Of course you have to provide food. And access to foodstuffs is important. But that isn't a solution itself. And parental education is critical. And in one of the research, we did a brilliant project funded by USAID and supported by Mercy Corps in Gaza, and we did 2 baselines in both years to see, and it was interesting. Over 75% of children are drinking tea with their breakfast and their food, and that has implications in terms of absorption of minerals and vitamins and so on and so forth. So parental education is critically important, and often in the context of our programs we can only do parental education. We pride ourselves of delivering the milk for preschoolers in Gaza for the best part of 10 years, but funders often don't want to do that. So what we have to do is actually provide parental education as a means of ensuring that whatever resources and foodstuffs are available are consumed in a decent way. So you need to do both, of course, but we can only do the health education, nutrition education, as we've done with parents, 10,000 mothers in Gaza. And it's great, you know, we've reached thousands of children. You know, stop beating your children, stop verbally and physically abusing them. Look at issues of health and nutrition and play. Really basic, 40-minute sessions. And the feedback we've had has been wonderful and documented by independent consultants. And it's great. But you need both. Thank you.
Any other questions? No. Okay. Well, join me in thanking our guests. I think they're here for a few more minutes if you want to talk to them.
Thank you.